Basic functions of the nervous system, like I said, this is just kind of a framework that I use to understand what's happening. There's so many different functions of the nervous system, but I really like to think about it as having an integrative function. So, well, some of the basic functions are to integrate these polarities, integrate these axes into like normative and unified and harmonious function. So it integrates internal and external information. So all of the sensory information about what we receive happening around us. So external information, internal information. So we're receiving all this information coming from the body, from the sensory system, from the motor system, from our vagus nerve, which we'll talk about, which is receiving a lot of interoceptive information from like the gut and the visceral organs. And really, it's integrating these functions. I have a couple of listed here. So it's integrating internal and external cues, integrating brain and body. So kind of like mind and body type stuff. It's integrating the past and the future. So we're operating with our previous experiences, our predictive programs, and we're predicting into the future. It's integrating left and right hemispheres, which if you know anything about Ian McGilchrist's work, there's actually kind of specification in the two different hemispheres of the brain in terms of like information processing and cognition, and also cortical and subcortical regions, which we'll also talk a little bit about, the kind of top down and bottom up information processing. So there's all of these axes that we're receiving information from, and the function is to mobilize responses, to receive this information and mobilize responses to maintain homeostasis, which I'll get to a bit. Is just the process of maintaining dynamic equilibrium. So to maintain homeostasis, and allostasis, which is the ability to make adaptations to change. So it requires multisensory integration across all of these axes. And it's worth noting that all of these functions are complex computational processes. So they operate through complex networks between functionally specified regions of the brain. I'll describe some of the anatomy of these functionally specified regions, but really it's a computational process between all of these regions that kind of gestalt together to create these larger, higher order functions. So while there are functionally specified regions of the brain, not one region of the brain is really responsible for generating one specific response or behavior activity. So we know these kind of overarching functional specifications of the nervous system, but how is it really doing that? Like, what are the parts that are really making up the whole here? So the nervous system generally is comprised of networks of cells, including, for the most part, neurons and glial cells, which are like support cells, that communicate primarily through electrical and chemical signals. It's a very basic overview, but electrical and chemical signals is basically the process of neurotransmission. So on a more zoomed in perspective, we have neurons, just individual neurons, and those neurons form connections between one another through synapses and are communicating through neurotransmission between one another. And those create neural pathways, and those neural pathways adapted between a lot of different functionally specified regions create neural networks. I think it's cool to note here, just in terms of our little paradox we're talking about, there's also certain forms of neural networks, which are what we call innate connectivity networks, that are wired through genetic programming. So every human baby who's born has these genetic programs, for the most part, that are giving instructions to wire innate connectivity networks that provide specific functions. An example of this, the default mode network, the salience network. These are just ways in which these neural pathways and neurons communicate with one another in stereotyped patterns to create specific functions. So that's more of like the ordered system of generating neural networks. And then there's also experience-dependent neural networks that are built. So experiences that we have, for example, memories. The way that memories are stored and consolidated in the brain is through what are called engrams, which are basically just like stored patterns of neural connectivity. And these are experience-dependent. So they happen based on what happens to us, and they're not wired through genetic instruction. So there's these kind of two different ways in which we can create neural pathways. So you know it, you love it. This is the autonomic nervous system. I know it, I love it. Very obviously, I'm going to tell you stuff you already know here, but this is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So like we know, the autonomic nervous system regulates a lot of our survival functions, and is bifurcated into these two kind of functional regions. So there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is really the active defense response, which is what we call the fight or flight response. The main neurotransmitter that it communicates through is adrenaline, which is, like I said, synthesized and released from the locus coeruleus, that region in the pons. And I just like to point out the anatomy of it here, just so you can kind of locate what we're talking about in the body of like, so it's not just hypothetical. The sympathetic nervous system exists in what's called the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is like a set of nerves, which synapse, which means they connect to the spinal cord. And then from there, connect to all of these different regions of the brain. So there are synapses of the sympathetic chain ganglia along the thoracic and lumbar spine. So from T1 to L2. And then from there, these are sending information to dilate the pupils, to inhibit the salivary secretions, to increase the heart rate, to dilate the bronchioles, to really, I like to think about the sympathetic nervous system from the perspective of energy deployment. And I like to think about this also because I'm trying to start thinking about a lot of nervous system functions from a metabolic perspective of looking at what adrenaline does and what sympathetic activation does is it provides the energy that allows for the deployment of an active defense response. There's two ways in which this happens. Of course, the locus coeruleus is releasing adrenaline in the central nervous system, but also there's information being sent down to the adrenal medulla, which is close to the kidneys. This also releases more adrenaline into the bloodstream. So there's the effect of the sympathetic nervous system being activated centrally, and then also it releases adrenaline into the blood, which has a further effect on really deploying energy for movement and for defensive responding. And a lot of times, this is really adaptive. A lot of times, our sympathetic nervous system being activated is going to create an adaptive response for us. So it's not like fight or flight. I think it's a bad name for like, because it's people just associate it with PTSD or what it's like in a kind of pathological sense, but adrenaline's great. It's like what mobilizes you to like get excited about something or to get ready to prepare for a speech, or like it deploys energy for you to be active and prepared and adaptive. And on the other side of this bifurcation of function, the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, which stereotypically we call the rest and digest or the feed and breed system. And it has opposite functions to a certain degree. It slows the heart rate down, it constricts the pupils, constricts the bronchioles, really slows the body down. And if you think about it, again, from this metabolic perspective I discussed of what it's doing for the energy deployment in the body, the parasympathetic nervous system really functions to conserve energy. So parasympathetic nervous system comes online, it activates higher than baseline after stress. So the parasympathetic nervous system really provides this role of stress recovery. So after a stressor, I have a slide I'll show you later to describe this. After a stressor, the parasympathetic nervous system comes back online to conserve energy, to allow for relaxation and recovery from a stress. The main neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. So this is just like the heart is regulated by a lot of acetylcholinergic activity. And I also like to point out the anatomy here because I think there's a wrongful stereotype that the parasympathetic nervous system only exists in the vagus nerve. This is incorrect. The cranial nerves, this is cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. So the parasympathetic nervous system is in these nerves and in sacral nerves 2, 3, and 4 down at the bottom here. So cranial nerve 3, the ocular motor nerve, it's related to a lot of musculature around the eye. The facial nerve, a lot of stuff like musculature around the vocal cords. Glossopharyngeal, I believe also same thing, like musculature around the larynx, and the vagus nerve, which I have a slide on, I believe the next slide, which as we know is the one it's this nerve here that's connecting to all of these visceral organs. Just like a cool note I like to make here is I think partially some of this parasympathetic regulation of the eyes and the voice and like facial expressions is partially why we can be so sensitive to the tone of people's voice and to the expressions on their faces, because they subtly signal to us the state of another person's nervous system. And this is a bit getting into this polyvagal stuff about it, like the vagus nerve regulating social relations and social connectivity. But our neuroceptive functions in the brain, partially related to this innate alarm system, which is receiving sensory information prior to our conscious awareness. We're hearing like, how tight are these muscles around the vocal cord? And could that signal to me that someone's in a heightened state of arousal? Or could the looseness in these muscles around the vocal cord signal that their parasympathetic nervous system is a bit more relaxed? And the same with the facial expressions and the eyes and the dilation of the pupils. So I think that's another way in which these other nerves in the parasympathetic nervous system can also relate to the social functions of what we talk about in polyvagal theory. So I like to take us back on a little journey, like I was talking about it last night. It's an evolutionary journey of like, where did these functions, where did this anatomy even come from? So the first primitive nerve net, so the first thing to really ever evolve with neurons, happened around, we think, 700 million years ago. And this derived in what are called cnidarians and ctenophores, so basically like jellyfish and comb jellies. So these things kind of like this. This is probably a more evolved cnidarian than what was around 700 million years ago. But they were the first organisms to evolve these primitive nerve nets that were just connections of cells which communicate through electrical and chemical activity. So this is a very primitive form of neurotransmission. And all this nerve net did was really control muscle contractions in response to sensory input. So if you just like keep your eyes open or closed or whatever, but like if you just imagine what it's like to be a biological organism 700 million years ago, whose only function, whose only capacity is really just to receive information from the movement of the water, the pressure of the water movement around you, and just initiate small, tiny muscle contractions in response to these very basic movements and pressure. That is what the first very early primitive nervous system containing organisms were capable of experiencing. And I think that also tells us a little bit about the function of the nervous system on a very basic level and how it's it developed in complexity over 700 million years. Next, then the next kind of a big advancement in evolutionary neurobiology was 600 million years ago. This is kind of basic numbers. We don't really know exactly, but it was in flatworms. So I'm not going to try to pronounce that word, but these are the first organisms that start having centralized nervous systems, which means that there's a lateralization of the nervous system. So there's a brain, it's first primitive brains, they have a central nervous system. So it's the first organisms that have these central computational units for processing information. So for receiving the sensory information, processing it, and then outputting motor responses. So the same thing, there's just an increase in complexity and the capacity to input to sensory information and output motor responses. There's very, very cool and interesting steps along the way, but those are just the kind of first two that are interesting to talk about. And then I'll talk a little bit about here, the evolution of the autonomic nervous system, which I think is also really cool to try and traverse evolutionary history through. But cool thing here is that it is thought that the parasympathetic nervous system evolved prior to the sympathetic nervous system, and really it evolved to provide this energy conservation function, this kind of metabolic function for reducing the heart rate, recovering, and just kind of stress recovery and like mediating homeostasis, really. So this evolved 500 years, million years ago, give or take, in these invertebrates, like cnidarians and mollusks. This is an incredibly nasty picture. But I forget the name for these, but we talk about these a lot in evolutionary neurobiology. They have centralized nervous systems, so they have the brain, but they don't have they don't have like vertebrates. So the nervous systems are a little bit more primitive. And this is the first primitive vagus nerve. So it's communicating with the specific neurotransmitter acetylcholine. It's innervating some of these organs, like visceral organs, to conserve energy. And then I know this says the same year, but like around the similar time, but after this primitive vagus nerve is evolved, we see the evolution of the sympathetic fibers. So this is the sympathetic chain ganglia starts to evolve. And it happens in early jawed vertebrates, like chondrichthyes, which are like cartilaginous fish, like sharks and rays. So I think it's like kind of makes sense that like the first sympathetic nervous systems, which evolved, we think, for the purpose of predation, so being able to initiate really quickly, quick responses to initiate this predator prey type dynamic, evolved in like the organism which you would think it would evolve in, which is the shark. Or like, other kind of cartilaginous fish like shark. So same thing, like maybe if you have some time, I won't go through the whole little meditation again, but you have some time to think about like, what would it be like to be a primitive organism with just a vagus nerve, with a centralized nervous system and with just this very basic capacity to receive information, respond, and to conserve your energy. And what would it be like to be a very primitive organism with a sympathetic nervous system? So your ability to perceive, detect threats, and perceive things and mobilize really fast responses. So that I think just gives insight into locating ourselves within the ecology of the organisms in evolutionary history.